Who's hosting? It's given? Does it mean it's
given?
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone. We were actually concerned we would not have an audience today given our winter wonderland. So thank you so much for coming today to this event. Welcome to the Center for Criminological Research, which is where we are today. My fabulous PhD student Brittany will be introducing our speaker in a moment, but before we do so, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sandra Basilius. I'm a professor in the Department for Sociology and the founder and director of the Center for Criminological Research, where we are today. The CCR its home is within the Department of Sociology, so that's how the structure works. And before we introduce Evan, I would just like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that the Center for Criminological Research and the University of Alberta, all its buildings, research centers, and labs are located on Treaty 6 territory, and that we respect the histories, sovereignty, lands, languages, knowledge systems, and cultures of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And with that, I'm going to give it over to Brittany Schreier, who is a PhD student in the department and who will introduce our speaker for today.
Welcome, everyone. As Sandra said, my name is Brittany. I'm a second-year PhD student here at the University of Alberta. And we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Evan McCuish to the CCR. We're very excited to have him present today. So Dr. McCuish is an associate professor at Simon Fraser University and the principal investigator of the Incarcerated Serious and Violent Young Offender Study, which is an ongoing study that began in 1998. So he actually first joined this incredible project as a research assistant when he was just 19 years old. I hope he doesn't mind that I just aged him in front of everyone. Dr. McCuish has received numerous accolades for his work, including first place in the American Psychology Law Society's Outstanding Dissertation Award. And he's also the co-winner of the American Society of Criminology's Division of Developmental and Life Course Criminology Early Career Research Award. So he publishes in many prominent criminological journals, and his research aligns very closely with our research here at the CCR, particularly the ongoing reentry study, which many of us are involved in or have contributed to. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. McCuish. Thank you.
Someone tripped the cord, maybe. That's pretty funny.
Okay.
I think we're in. Okay, and where can we put this up? Thank you.
If I stand over here, can people on Zoom still hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, thank you, Sandra, for inviting me here. Thank you for Brittany for the introduction. For all of Sandra's students who've given me such a warm welcome, and for all of you who are here braving the snow and everything like that. I'm really glad that I got to come here in person because the finding from the paper that I'm going to be talking about was one that was really unexpected. I think in some ways, maybe controversial, surprising, and I think it's really important to have discussions about these findings in person rather than online. I think back and forth is really important. So there'll be plenty of time for questions, but if there's anything that is immediate that is not understood, please feel free to interrupt during the presentation and everything like that. I have a habit my first slide of every presentation always takes me like 10 minutes to get through. So I promise I haven't forgotten to switch through the slides. I tend to ramble to begin. But to begin, we've got a painting here by Van Gogh talking about sort of the monotony, the doldrums of being incarcerated, how miserable life could be, the repetitive nature, nothing to do, and how that can have such a significant negative impact on one's mental health. So this was 1890, and if we were to flash forward 200 years, we might argue that perhaps not much has changed. We still continue to see issues in custody centers with respect to a lack of services, a lack of programming. We see that certain groups coming from especially marginalized or oppressed backgrounds, especially experience difficulties in prison. And then in 2021, Damon Petrick, who is a former SFU master student and then was doing his PhD at University of Cincinnati at the time, came out with a meta-analysis of about 116 studies that had quantitatively examined the relationship between time spent incarcerated and reoffending following community reentry. And they concluded basically that incarceration either has a null effect, so there's no impact on reoffending, or a criminogenic effect on reoffending, so actually increases somebody's likelihood of reoffending. And so we've seen the downsides of prison being a restriction on freedoms. It can disrupt access to housing. It can disrupt relationships with families. The counter argument has always been that, well, and we can disagree with this counter argument. The counter argument has been, if all these sort of rights that we violate are fine, if it's going to actually lead to reductions in reoffending, we can justify restrictions on freedoms if it creates a benefit to public safety. And it could be very easy to argue based on the Petrick et al. Meta-analysis that clearly it's not improving public safety. In fact, it might in certain jurisdictions be increasing risk to public safety because people are now more at risk of reoffending following their period of incarceration. So Petrick basically said that the impact of incarceration on reoffending is universal. And I didn't agree with this, and especially because Damon's Canadian, I was like, come on, Damon, 80% of your studies were from the United States and conducted in periods where there were, concerted effort to increase the use of privatized prisons. We saw in the United States mass incarceration. We also saw during this period of time, so it's 80% of studies. But if we look at the average Canadian study, it would be a sample of 200 to 300 people. In the average American study, it would be 10,000 people from an entire state. And so not only is it the sample sizes of the United States studies are overweighting other studies. So I said, well, is this actually truly universal? We need to actually examine this. And so this is what I did in the paper that I'm here to talk about today. And I did this with my co-authors, Sean Bushway, Kelsey Gushu, who's a PhD candidate in the School of Criminology, and my former supervisor, Patrick Lucier. So there are effectively 4 key points, or there are going to be 4 conclusions that I'll make in sort of this presentation, but I want to make sure that these conclusions sort of are clear and how I'm reaching them. So I'm going to start with the conclusions and then work backwards. So one of the things that I want to say is that it's very difficult to quantitatively study the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. And this is basically for 2 main reasons that I'll get into. I've already talked about this, but we need to contextualize our research findings because the experience in British Columbia, I spent about 10 years working in the Burnaby Youth Custody Center, whether it was beginning as a volunteer and then as a research assistant, project manager, principal investigator. And the ways in which custody had been described in a lot of the literature was not the ways that I was experiencing. We would go into the custody center and we would work out of case management. So it'd be a room just like this, with a huge sort of case table, and probation officers, case managers, nurses, police officers would all come together to talk about reentry planning and programs for youth. And this was just not the way that custody experiences were talked about in the American literature. We'll get into the paper and our finding, which I won't hide the spoilers about. We found that as individuals spent more time in custody from 1 year to the next, they subsequently experienced a decrease in the number of convictions from 1 year to the next. So that's some technical language, but basically saying that incarceration reduced reoffending for this sample of incarcerated kids who are followed into adulthood. But what I really want to emphasize is that just because in this one case we see a reduction in reoffending doesn't mean that we stop looking for alternatives to incarceration. Incarceration shouldn't therefore be the answer. And in fact, if we were to look at incarceration as the answer and, for example, decide maybe we should incarcerate more people, I think our research findings would actually change. So I'm going to emphasize that towards the end of the presentation as well. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit just about some of the challenges in doing research on incarceration and reoffending from a quantitative perspective. So one being the methods that we use, what I'll call our practice, diverge from how we theoretically describe or think about the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. So many of us in the room will be familiar with labeling theory, the idea that once you're labeled, maybe that will increase your risk of repeating the same negative behavior. So this is describing a process, and this is going to be kind of key to the talk in my analyses, is it's a process of within individual change. Something is happening to the individual, and we're seeing that have an impact on their behavior. It's not just theory, though, it's also policy and practice. So when we think about the courts and sentencing practices, whether we're talking about Canada, the United States, or elsewhere, another thing that we use is what's called recidivism sentencing premiums. So it's the idea that if an individual has a prior history of criminal behavior, that will be treated as an aggravating circumstance during sentencing, and we will punish that person more severely based on the idea that that increased severity of punishment will lead to, in theory, a decrease in reoffending. So that's the whole idea of incarceration and reoffending is tied to the individual. But how we go about studying it is through between group analyses. We compare people who are in prison to people who are on probation. That's the most common strategy. And we see where probationers more likely to reoffend compared to people who serve time in custody. That is the wrong way to do things, or at least that makes things very difficult for us, not just from wanting to make sure that our methods align with our theories, but because there are actually some really technical challenges with studying the relationship between incarceration and reoffending from a between group perspective. And that's kind of reflected in this slide here. So we have different risk factors, need factors, maybe it's prior criminal history, we can even include demographic characteristics. All of these factors go into a person's likelihood of offending. That likelihood or that propensity to offend can lead to the increased likelihood that somebody is going to be incarcerated rather than put on probation. Now, the problem is there's a specific reason, usually, or at least we would hope, that some people receive a custody sentence and some people receive a probation sentence. Typically, it's the person receiving a custody sentence engaged in a more severe offense or had a greater level of risk factors, or something that we might think to be qualitatively unique about that person compared to somebody who might receive a probation sentence. But then what happens is when we try to look at reoffending, which is over here, incarceration might increase the risk of reoffending, but is it because of incarceration, or is it because people who are incarcerated are qualitatively distinct from people who have been placed on probation? And it is those qualitative differences that is actually capturing why somebody might be a higher risk to reoffend or a lower risk to reoffend, as two examples. So to give you sort of a brief summary of how we are looking at prior research, I say I, but this wasn't my idea, boiling it down to 3 different generations of how we've approached this. And I want to sort of talk about just briefly why these were problematic approaches that necessitated the approach that we used in our study. So the first were these kind of, and this was like 99% of Canadian studies are based on like first generation research methods, which, to be honest, like American researchers left these approaches in the dust decades ago. The problem with regression methods is the issue that, excuse me, I forgot to mention is what I'm talking about here is selection bias. So people they don't literally self-select as in they choose to be in prison, but just as in like certain personality traits might dictate who you choose to hang out with or who you look for in a partner. We can think about certain characteristics leading to self-selection into prison. Again, not suggesting that people are actually actively choosing to go to prison, although that can in some cases happen. So you need to account for this selection bias. And one way of doing that is just, we've heard this in our stats 101 classes, the things that we have to control for. We can statistically control for gender, race, prior criminal history. These are poorly suited to actually address the selection bias issue. Second generation methods have developed what we call this matching technique. So we'd find somebody on probation and somebody who maybe experienced a prison sentence, and we would try to match them on what we believe to be key factors for reoffending. So we try to make sure that we have one person in the sample who is male, white, and has their age of onset of offending was 15. We would try to match them to somebody on probation who is male, white, and age of onset at age 15. The difficulty is there's an infinite number of factors that we actually should account for. And so studies that have reviewed and the actual statistical method of propensity score modeling show that these are also unable to address selection bias. What happens is, what if we can't match somebody? Then they get excluded. If we don't keep them in the analysis. And so the people who we might be maybe most interested in actually just end up getting dropped from the analysis. So a lot of American researchers have approached this problem using what we would call regression discontinuity designs. And so in the United States, they'll have, for example, whether it's a judge or someone else, filling out these sentencing tables. And it will dictate whether somebody gets a prison sentence or a non-prison sentence. And what they will do is they'll say, well, if somebody is just barely above the threshold for receiving a prison sentence, and another person is just barely below the threshold for receiving a prison sentence, we will treat them as not literally identical, but close enough to being identical that we've now addressed this issue of selection bias. And studies evaluating this technique do show that it actually is relatively effective at addressing selection bias. But what it does is it creates very unrealistic counterfactuals. What I mean by this is, who are we comparing? It is people who are on the margins of receiving a custody sentence. So by that I mean people who just barely got into custody or just barely did not get into custody. So we're excluding, for example, the people for whom it was very, in the eyes of a US judge, for example, very obvious that they should be receiving a custody sentence. So the people who maybe have committed most serious and violent offenses do not get included in these studies examining the relationship between incarceration and reoffending. So the approach that basically we proposed is to study this phenomenon from a within individual perspective by examining change. So we think that this is a little bit more appropriate because it helps us better be more in sync with theories and policies, like I talked about, recidivism, sentencing premiums, labeling, framing. It's all ideas of, we interpret, for example, with framing, we're interpreting our likelihood of future offending based on our past experiences. This is somebody drawing upon their individual experience, and we need to capture that experience in our analysis. You won't need to understand the analyses to understand the findings from the paper that I'll be discussing, but within individual analyses, help account for any time invariant factor that you could imagine. And I'll provide a demonstration of how this actually works. But if we think of a time invariant factor as something like age of onset of offending, we know that age of onset can be a risk factor for future offending. If my age of onset of offending is age 15, well, when I'm 20, my age of onset of offending is 15. When I'm 30, it's 15. When I'm 45, it's 15. It doesn't matter what age I'm at, that factor remains the same. So we're able to account for all of these factors within individual analysis. without actually even having to measure them, and I'll explain how that works in a bit. For the population, the third generation studies have been a useful solution to the selection bias problem, but for example, we don't, at least in British Columbia, use sentencing tables, so it's not really an option for us to develop that type of study. We also don't want to restrict our analyses to people on the margins, as I'll talk about in this presentation. The kids in our sample are an extremely small slice of people who end up in the criminal justice system in British Columbia, but this at least will allow us to study that population. So that brings me to what I would like to talk about next, which is sort of the custody context in BC. And my experience is mainly from being in youth custody centers. So when I started as a 19-year-old, thank you, there were 3 youth custody centers in British Columbia, and that was down from, when the study started in 1998, there were maybe 12 to 14. So we've seen reductions in the incarceration facilities in BC. When I started, I worked mainly out of the Burnaby Custody Center, which is sort of just in the Metro Vancouver area, for about, on a day-to-day basis, about 110 kids in custody. There were 2 units for girls and about 8 units for boys, with about 8 kids in each unit, and some were open units, some were secure units. Usually the secure units were for kids who were still on remand. The open units were primarily for kids who had been sentenced. So I started around 2007. By 2011, the count at the Burnaby Youth Custody Center was 8. So the reliance on incarceration as a strategy for reducing reoffending in BC makes up a small part of our strategy for reducing reoffending. So when I was there, the custody context was governed by the YCGA, but even before the Youth Criminal Justice Act, even before the YCGA was implemented in 2003, BC did place a fairly good emphasis on rehabilitation. So when I would go into the custody center, we could not interview kids if they were in a rehabilitative program. And they were in rehabilitative programs basically straight from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. with breaks for lunch and stuff like that, which obviously wouldn't interrupt. And then even during the evenings, they would be in and out of rehabilitative programs. So the Van Gogh painting was not my experience when I was in the custody center. And again, what I want to emphasize is at no point am I ever arguing that the custody center was a good place for me. But good and better are often different things. And for some of these kids, and I'll talk a little bit about their experiences, they came from such extremely difficult backgrounds that it very often was an improvement on their life in the community. And that's not just my impression. It was their words that things were safer in prison. There were plenty of fights in prison. Prison was safer for them than in the community. So the sort of overarching philosophy of incarceration in BC, the intended purpose is often structured by, many of us might be familiar with the risk-need responsivity model. So risk dictating basically when we're talking about selection bias, or lower risk people and higher risk people, and this helps dictate what type of or whether to intervene. Very often with youth, we've actually found that the argument is actually not to intervene at all. And sometimes the lack of intervention, and this can actually become a problem down the line, but at least in theory to start, not intervening is actually potentially better for preventing reoffending than intervening with too intensive of a response. Needs is exactly what it sounds like. What does the person actually need in terms of their rehabilitative progress? And responsivity is how we should work. And we can think about this in 2 ways. One is the specific program that they need, matching the type of program to the needs that they have. The other one is matching the type of intervention practitioner to the youth themselves. So thinking about cultural alignment, language alignment, and everything like that. And so the idea in BC custody context, and this includes the adult custody context, is as soon as you come into custody, you get mental health screening right away. Programs are basically offered regularly, both in the youth system and in the adult system. Surveys of about 4,000 adults involved with BC Corrections asked them about their attitudes towards the services that were being provided, and about 70% said that they were satisfied. So again, 70% is not 100%, but it is higher than maybe what we would expect for a similar study done in the United States. So this is the intended purpose of prison. It doesn't mean that that's actually successful everywhere. The reason why I think we do need unique studies in Canada is in part because of differences in crime rates and the use of incarceration. So we can, and I've used the term, and then I was called a dummy by Sandra, but don't worry, I was called much worse online. My opinion, if we consider over-incarceration and mass incarceration as separate concepts, Canada has an issue with over-incarceration of certain groups. But when I think about mass incarceration in the United States, and the rate of incarceration there, it does not look similar to the rate of incarceration, and that's all I'm talking about here, rates of incarceration. They're much different in Canada. And we can see, so in the United States during this similar period, it was about 196 to 355 youth per 100,000. And it's also impossible to get really good data from the United States because it's all statewide. And so it varies state to state. Now there is a website. I think I put it in the notes. And if you want it, I'm happy to send it to you, that shows now rates by state. It's probably closer to 355 per youth per 100,000. And this is an underestimate because the United States has the practice of incarcerating youth in adult facilities as well, which is not done in Canada, at least if we're defining youth as ages 12 to 17. There's reasons to not define youth in that way, but we can see a steady decline, whether it's BC, whether it's Alberta, even when we're looking at Canada more generally. So I've looked at the period 1998 to 2011 because that's when we were recruiting youth for the incarcerated serious and violent young offender study. And I also want to mention that we want to talk about the participants in our study using person-centered language and not referring to them as offenders, for example. The study was started in 1998 where we weren't necessarily thinking about these things, and we decided not to change the title of the study to avoid confusing people who were doing meta-analyses. For example, if we were to change the name of the study, we might start having our data counted twice by other researchers, and we didn't want that to happen, so we've left that name. But anyways, this is the most recent period in which we have data, and you can see that it's barely on the graph. In BC, we were having, I think it was on average 6 kids incarcerated per day. So very low compared to what we're used to. And that's why I think we need these Canadian-based studies, is to kind of understand our own context. I'll talk a little bit about this study, but just to kind of re-emphasize, and I'm not 100% sure how I'm doing for time. I'll try and get going here. This is the Burnaby Youth Custody Center. It's where we spent our dark, rainy, miserable winters, where time really does stand still, which also made me reflect on what it must be like to be incarcerated. If I'm free to leave the custody center and time is feeling like it's standing still, it must be quite a difficult experience for these youth, even if it is making them safer than when they were in the community, or providing them with services that they wouldn't have otherwise received in the community. The other point that I want to make is there's good reasons to not incarcerate youth simply to improve their life. We saw one of the reasons why we had a much higher crime rate or incarceration rates in the late 1990s is that youth, especially girls, were being incarcerated for protectionist purposes. They were not being incarcerated because of the offense that they had committed. They were being incarcerated because they believed that this would give them a break from being victimized in the community. And I think we quite clearly need to find a solution where we prevent them from being victimized in the community while allowing them to continue to be in the community. So you're not going to be able to see the text here, but basically I wanted to give you kind of the profile of the type of youth that we were interviewing in custody. I didn't pick John because he was extremely unique. In fact, he had, relatively average levels of offending in adolescence, but to give you kind of a sense of what his background was like. So social environment, he did not know his biological father. He did not want to live with his biological mother and did not want to have a relationship with one of his biological siblings. His mother struggled with substance use issues, and his mother's boyfriends regularly abused John and his other siblings. When it came to foster care placements, John was in and out of about 30 different foster care placements by the time he was about 15, 16 years old. The variety of ways in which our participants experienced abuse was really, in some ways, I became glad to take a break from interviewing, because like boiling water in a spoon and then forcing their child to drink that so that social workers wouldn't be able to detect any physical injury. Like there was just the number of ways in which they experienced trauma is what just definitely stood out to me when doing these interviews. John was assessed and diagnosed with FASD. He was, in his interview, they are provided ratings or self-descriptions, and he described himself as unattractive and poor. We're focusing a lot, and this is how I got into the project, from psychological background, different sort of levels of anger and irritability, and John scored very high on those. He began using alcohol and ecstasy at age 12. And in terms of criminal behavior, foster care, and I want to be very clear when I'm not critical, but describing his foster care experience, this is not representative of foster care in BC, because we're talking about among incarcerated kids who also experience foster care. We're not talking about foster care experiences more generally, but this is where John really developed a negative peer group, moving in and out of foster care, and he was either being beaten up by kids in foster care or engaging in crime with other kids who were also in foster care. So between ages 12 and 17, he had 26 convictions and spent more than 1,000 days in custody. And when I was a grad student, I read a book by Lobb and Sampson that basically was following American kids from around the 1930s, 40s, who had experienced being sent to reformatory schools. And in this book, Lobb and Sampson made a few declarations that didn't really comport, again, with my experience of things. One of their declarations was that people desist by default, so that desistance just kind of happens naturally over time. And one of the reasons why they said desistance happens by default is because acquiring informal social control, or what they would call turning points, social bonds, is a normative part of the life course. So they basically denied this idea of selection bias and said that in America, our social structure system is set up to funnel people into these social roles. And I had trouble imagining that this would actually occur for a lot of the youth in our study, given how difficult their backgrounds like John's actually were. So we wanted to then figure out what is going on with John in adulthood. And so we used a software program called Cornet that is run by BC Corrections, that allows us to get access to pre-sentence reports, risk assessments, criminal histories, pages and pages of community probation officer notes. While they're in custody, we get their daily logs of what they're doing and everything like that. So then can look at these different outcomes for John in adults in terms of social environment. He had issues with intimate partner violence, issues with family members, regularly unhoused, emotional stability issues that led to repeated involvement in criminal behavior. As I mentioned, FASD was one of the diagnoses he had in adolescence, which affects executive functioning. So his ability to work through day-to-day issues was extremely challenged for him. He used near daily use of crystal methamphetamine, which led to a drug-induced psychosis. Between ages 18 to 28, he incurred 9 new convictions and spent 1,300 days in custody. And he's still currently in custody, where he saw someone smiling on a bench and didn't like the fact that they were smiling and stabbed that person. So my background was actually never in wanting to look at prisons and the prison and the incarceration experience. But what I was trying to do, I was writing a book with colleagues about sort of pushing back at some of the ideas that Lobb and Sampson had suggested about desistance by default. And we were examining informal social control. So we're examining turning points. We're examining how this relates to reoffending. We wanted to control for incarceration because we thought that if you're in custody, you won't have an opportunity to incur new convictions, so we better control for that. And so we were just looking at a very simple correlation matrix, and I came across something that was pretty surprising to me. I was looking at changes in incarceration from 1 year to the next, and changes in convictions from 1 year to the next. And all you need to care about really here for purposes of this slide is this diagonal. On the diagonal, the relationship is negative, which means increases in incarceration were associated with decreases in convictions. And so I said, okay, like this paper got published beginning of 2025. We saw this around 2020. And we wanted to be very, very careful that this was actually a real finding. But I know there are a lot of grad students today, and I think it's just so wonderful to hear how many of you are actually going into custody centers and actually, putting boots to pavement and doing the work. Because one of my mentors explained to me, like, this is what happens when you do this, is you get this intraocular effect. Ideas just hit you right between the eyes. You don't have to be a genius. You don't have to be smart. You just have to do the work and the ideas will come to you. So let's talk a little bit about the paper. So just, it's here, that's the title. It's open access, so you don't need a university account to get access to it. It's all available for free. So the idea here was we wanted to just examine the relationship between changes in incarceration and changes in reconvictions, using an analysis that I'll get into, but we also wanted to acknowledge that, well, maybe we have some different things going on, because some of our kids were born in 1979 and some of our kids were born in 1998. So some of these kids are now 40-something years old. We might have what we would call birth cohort effects, where people born in specific times might have unique characteristics. That's why we've got labels like millennial and Gen Z and everything like that. We might also have period effects, where going through specific slices of the life course will affect you differently from people who did not go through those things. So we had some people adjudicated under the Young Offenders Act, some under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, and we wanted to be able to kind of distinguish between these experiences. So I'm going to walk everyone through how we do this analysis and why we do this analysis. So if you get this after me talking to you, you're way ahead of me. I didn't get this by looking at a slide and then it came to me naturally. This was during COVID. Sean Bushway, who I can't remember if he did his undergrad or his master's in math, he did one of the two in math, just humbling me over and over again, teaching me how to do algebra. It was, yeah, like it's the beautiful part of our job is we just get to perpetually learn. And so what we're looking at is changes in incarceration for an individual. You can call him John. So the individual, John, is I, and T is just time. It's a wave. So in this case, it's a year. So maybe it's age 12, maybe it's age 14. -1 just means the year prior. So if we're looking at 14, this means we're looking at 13. Same thing for incarceration. It's just the exact same thing, but one wave prior, because we want to examine incarceration's future impact, not the same time. It's what happens in the future. So we have John here. We have his ages at 14, 15, 16. We have the number of convictions that have happened, the number of incarceration, days incarcerated, and on and on. We also have John as being white. So, for example, if in our data set, white is coded as 1 and non-white is coded as 0, but if we're looking at John's self-reported ethnicity, well, it's just 1 minus 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. So there's nothing to actually examine. So this is at the beginning when I was talking about selection bias. So how do we account for these time invariant factors? If we examine a time invariant factor over time, it actually doesn't change. And if we're interested in change, change is actually 0. There's no change. So it gets parceled out of the analysis. So what we're left with is error and the impact of incarceration on reoffending. And so what we found using this analysis is that a year-over-year increase in the number of days spent incarcerated is associated with, in the future, a year-over-year decrease in the number of convictions. And we examined this in different ways. So we examined first select ages 12 to 25 as our time frame, just looking at year-over-year change across that period. We selected 25 just because about 90% of our sample was at least age 25. What we wanted to examine, well, is this maybe only specific to youth experiences because the adult custody experience might be different? And we actually did see the same relationship, but stronger during the youth period compared to the adult period. We examined things for boys versus girls. We examined things for those who were adjudicated under the Young Offenders Act, which is those who were adjudicated under the Youth Criminal Justice Act. We looked at different birth cohorts. We looked at maybe it's specific to reductions in violent convictions only. Maybe it's specific to reductions in technical convictions only, so violations of or administrative-based offenses. Didn't matter how we analyzed the data, we kept getting the general same result, which is that we would see a reduction in reoffending over time. This happened even when we were increasing the lag, so we would look at total amounts of time incarcerated between ages 12 to 17. Did that change between ages 18 to 23? And did that change convictions from 23 to 24 or 23 to 18 to 23 to 24 to 29? Just, I know I've said a lot of words, but it's all the same. We keep seeing the same thing. The same thing doesn't mean that this is universal. It just means this is what we found in our one specific study using this one particular method. So I just want to wrap things up by giving some context to our findings. And I think, again, this is my main point here is just because incarceration reduced reoffending does not mean we should stop looking for alternatives to incarceration. I don't necessarily think that the only reason we found what we did was because of our analytic strategy. We used a different method compared to studies in the United States. I think it's also because the incarceration experience is different in Canada compared to the United States. If we look at these findings and then say we should therefore increase the use of incarceration, we become more similar to the approach in the United States. And I would suspect that the data would also change and then the results would also change. So it's also not suggesting that we maintain the status quo, but it is suggesting that for this small group of youth adjudicated in BC, incarceration did reduce their reoffending. So just again to give some context, there's some things that are missing from this study. And I'll get into this on one of the last slides, but we cannot from the data say whether the reason why reductions in reoffending occurred was because of deterrence. Was it because of rehabilitative programs accessed while in custody? Was it because people who received lengthier incarceration spells were also more likely to then be followed more closely in the community. They were subject to closer supervision and monitoring if they had spent 300 days in custody and then were released compared to if they had previously spent only 10 days in custody. So we have to think that this is just saying that reductions occurred. We're not making a conclusion as to why this actually occurred. And it's again also need to not turn our eyes away to the idea that there have been correctional reports indicating that force is disproportionately used against Black and Indigenous persons. We have concerns about across Canada whether there are positive reintegrative practices going on in all prisons. And keeping in mind that this is just one study reflecting a very specific group of people. So what did we miss about John? So we often think about prisons as kind of being this black box, and what our next steps are to begin to try to address the question of, was it deterrence? Was it rehabilitation? Was it something else? So we've got perceptions of incarceration. What was their incarceration experience like? Did they feel that this would prevent them from reoffending in the future? What was their access to programming like? How did being incarcerated affect their criminogenic networks, both in positive and negative ways potentially, but also did it result in disrupting criminogenic social ties in the community, especially if they were returned to a different neighborhood or different community? And then also looking at types of probation conditions or community reentry conditions that may have impacted the likelihood of them continuing to offend. So that's all I have in terms of slides, but thank you very much for being here and braving the weather.
Thank you so much, Evan. I will stand here and I will take questions. I will not take the questions. Evan will take the questions from the audience and also on Zoom. So if you have any questions on Zoom, I'll scoot over there and make sure. But well done, you guys.
Hey, so thank you so much for the presentation. I do have to ask the question. So given your results show incarceration is followed by reduced convictions, even if due to Canadian rehabilitative context, you guard against your findings being co-opted by punitive policy actors to justify longer or earlier incarceration, especially under current political law.
Yeah, I mean, that's why it took 4 years. We wanted to write very carefully. I think I don't like repeating myself in papers, but in this paper, we in the abstract and the introduction and the discussion section, we tried to be very clear. Like, this does not reflect not just a call to increase use of custody, but this does not reflect a reason to maintain the status quo. And I hate doing I don't want to sound like it's awful, but they've got a great job. But one of the worst parts of the job is media interviews, because I think that they are high risk, no reward. For me, I mean, maybe if I got better at it, there'd be some reward, but I felt obligated to do media interviews and make sure that the message was clear. So whether it was, radio, TV, podcasts, I felt obligated to accept those invitations because it was my responsibility to make sure things were not being misinterpreted.
I have one question online that I will take first. So this question is by Tyler Dunford, who works for the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Services. And he is asking, can you tell us a little bit more about the kind of case management that was provided? How heavily was it based on R&R? How much was focused on antisocial values, for example?
Yeah, great question. So for both the youth and adult system, the province uses, or at least at the time, they've changed the instrument. It was called basically a community risk needs assessment that was developed by Dr. Bill Blackman, who's a former faculty member in the School of Criminology. This was developed in the early 1990s and then refined. And we have kids who had a CRNA assessment in 1997, and we have people in our lab right now collecting CRNA assessments that were done yesterday. So it's been used for years and years and years. BC Corrections is doing its own evaluations of reliability, and they do have some concerns, and they don't want to speak for them, especially because I might get it wrong, but concerns about things like inter-rater reliability, where, for example, there's one probation officer assessed this person differently than the same probation officer with the same information. But to more directly sort of answer the question about the CRNA, it was designed basically exactly through the R&R model and Andrew and Vonta's central 8 risk factors. So there's only one item that actually measures antisocial attitudes. On the instrument itself, there are static indicators of prior criminal history of violence, their risk to reoffend level, and their institutional safety level. And then 8 dynamic risk factors that will include things like financial stability, housing, antisocial attitudes, substance misuse, family relationships, intimate partner relationships. And I've missed a couple, but it follows the R&R model quite closely. And there's a manual that you can find online. If you type in into Google, like community risk needs assessment, BC Corrections, there's a PDF manual that walks through how the probation officers implement that tool into their case management practices. So it's one thing to do the CRNA, it's another thing to have that information actually inform the duties of your job and the recommendations that you make. So the CRNA would be completed at a minimum of every 6 months. And so we have for kids like an average of over the life course, probably 15 to 20 different ratings on the CRNA. But what we're not able to do or allowed to do is investigate the degree to which probation officers are actually following what the tool is actually, what they have said and what they do could be the same, it could be different, and we haven't been allowed to evaluate that specific question.
Okay, we'll first take audience, so Dr. Schultz, then Leanne, and then I'll take Rebecca online.
Really interesting presentation. One quick question. Did remand status figure into any of your findings? And the reason I'm saying this is kind of over the same period you're examining this massive drop in youth incarceration. We've seen this massive growth in remand custody. And sometimes it feels like the remand custody thing is a little bit of a black box. You know, people get locked up, but be incarcerated for certain periods of time. Sometimes it falls into conviction, sometimes with overcrowded court systems, it's just a triage moment. Now, that's more the adult side of things. The youth court system I know is quite different, but given that you're quite explicitly looking at like these incarceration factors, did that play into your analysis at all?
Yeah, I screwed up. So, so I screwed up a decade ago.
Oh, okay.
So,
not here.
So when I was a PhD student, and I was like, I want to know. I read a lot of this. I want to know what happens to our kids, and you know, what I think that things aren't going to go well, but I can't just think that. I need to actually collect the data. And so we would go into the custody. We didn't even have funding. Like I had my PhD church scholarship, which was for something else, but I would just drive out to the prison and stop at Tim Hortons and have my, get 2 coffees because I didn't want to leave again, and then just code. And the plan was initially to code and distinguish between remand and when it was a custody sentence. I just didn't have time. Like it was things have changed, but at that time it was just me, and I had 1,719 kids to code. And, I mean, many people in here know they're getting remanded twice a week, and I can't keep ticking this box. I've got to actually get my dissertation done at some point in my lifetime. So I said, well, we're not going to make this distinction. We're going to code the number of days they spend. So it'd be April 20th to April 30th. New line, and then they're back in May 2nd, May 5th out, and we just code that way. I do suspect that things would differ for adults because, again, I wasn't, this is a much smaller experience going into adult institutions, but like the Surrey Pretrial Center was not, it was just way different from any place that I'd ever been before. For the youth, the differences between secure and open custody were very small. So there were some sentenced kids in secure, but most of the secure kids were on remand. But it's basically like the differences were like who got to go and cook meals for the center and stuff like that. It wasn't really about programming, except for when it came to offense-specific programming. So, for example, if a youth had been charged with a sex offense, they couldn't receive any sex offense specific treatment until they had been sentenced because they had not yet been found guilty of that sex offense. So some treatment options weren't available, but for the most part, remand and sentence was quite similar. It was in the same building, same stuff.
I have Leanne in the back.
Thanks so much for a very interesting presentation, and I really appreciate your continued emphasis that we should look towards alternatives to incarceration in spite of what the findings show. What I would like to find out is whether you have any plans to extend this type of research to other Canadian contexts. And reason being, yes, there are different dynamics surrounding youth and adult incarceration, but research that UAB did here with Dr. Buceras at prisons, what we found is that when inmates are comfortable in the environment, they tend to do things to get back in post-incarceration. So that's another dynamic, because I noticed in your presentation, you indicated that they were comfortable and they felt safer in prison systems. So, it would be interesting to see within other Canadian provinces and contexts whether these results using the same methods are, what you find or something different.
Yeah, great question. And I think like Sandra and I were talking about this yesterday. Is the opportunity that you all have to actually interview people post-incarceration is just so unique. It's something that we were not able to do. We were able to re-interview, but only when they were back in custody as kids. And we wouldn't do the same interview. We would ask different questions and things like that. So, funnily enough, this project is officially, it started in 1998 and it's officially ending March 31st. So we're no longer able to access Cornet to collect the data on this topic or on any ISQS participants anymore, not for any specific reason other than we have such incredible access, and it was very unique and a system that was really not supposed to have occurred. Like we weren't supposed to be able to get this level of access. We got this, we just did the research at a very serendipitous time, and we were able to give access that most people aren't, and now they want to kind of close this loophole. So I'm I've been working on this project for a long time, and I'm looking forward to actually kind of a break. But yes, absolutely. I think one of the really important things is to get a better understanding of the perceptions of custody, because I think they will be very different across different people, especially, people who are from the youth system who enter adult custody, but people who are first time experiencing custody as adults. I think those are very potentially unique circumstances, and we want to tease that out a little bit. Did that answer the question?
I think just in terms of the level of access, when you told me about this yesterday, I've never heard of that, and I'm not sure everyone sort of caught on to, but you have an app and you get anything and everything that has ever been written about the person, essentially.
Yeah.
Which is not something that we can replicate here at U of A, because we don't have access to any of the official records as yet, right? So it's a very unique situation for sure. So there's first Rebecca and then Gabe. So Rebecca is asking, did a decrease in new convictions year after year account for reincarceration for breaches in conditions.
Yes, so one of the things that we did was account for what we call it exposure time. So during the period in which we were measuring convictions, we accounted for the time that they were actually back in custody, because maybe we saw a reduction in convictions, but it was because they spent 364 days in custody, and so they didn't have an opportunity for new convictions. So the way that exposure time works is almost just like prorating. So if you had, let's say, making up numbers here, but 6 convictions and 6 months in custody at age 16, with exposure time accounted for, it would be 12 convictions over a full period, or full, what would be a realized period. Now, obviously that's not true. It's not like they actually did incur 12 convictions, but we just account for that change in the ratio of time free versus time in custody.
Okay, I have one more hand.
Thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I think it's very interesting, the longitudinal gamut that this has covered. And with that, you've talked about some things that remain static, but then there's those other factors that change, like the offenders, there's justice, things like that. I'm curious, the first instance, and of course that age of first instance can change, and so can the crime severity of that first instance. Throughout the different and over the time, have you seen any differences, or has anything come out with the level of severity in that first crime instance over the time?
So, like for example, I just want to make sure that I understand. Like, say, if we had kids under the YOA, was their first offense more severe compared to kids under the YCJ? Or is it
more so over the course of the time? Have you noticed any changes in the crime severity of that first instance?
So
for
for
other things
the
have changed that, and has, like, was there any inferences that you could make, or have you noticed any differences along the way?
so like for the within the individual, did we see maybe they were committing fewer offenses, but the severity of those offenses increased over time? Is that kind of
Sorry, like that first instance, was it 15, are you noticing any trends? 15 was a chocolate bar, or it's a salty age? You know what I mean? Like, over time, are you seeing that the severity of youth crime is?
I think, sorry, I
Yeah.
think I maybe have got you a little bit here. And the answer is yes, but with a very big qualification. One of the reasons why we might, like, let's see that for this person at this period, their first recorded offense that went into BC Corrections system, which captures any court appearance. Maybe it was for stealing a chocolate bar. And then later on, we see for this cohort, their first offenses was more like causing bodily harm, causing bodily harm. So we could say, oh, maybe we're seeing a trend towards more serious offending. But what we have to be careful of is this because the Youth Criminal Justice Act, for example, has been recommending diversion and extrajudicial measures. And so what we've had, and we talked to both police officers and community service providers. Police officers are being told, don't arrest, don't put them in the formal system. And so maybe this young person appears to have started their, I don't like this term, but their criminal career with a really serious offense. But if we were to interview them, they would talk about how no, my offending behavior actually started earlier and I had police contacts, but this didn't happen. But why not, I think, is I'm not going to argue that we need to have more formal arrests or anything like that, but talking to service providers in the community, one of the challenges they experience is they can't do anything until they receive a referral from a police officer. And so there's a young person, and what we might be creating unintentionally is a service gap, where this young person was in need of services, but was not actually getting them because we weren't, and again, it's nobody's fault. Everyone's doing their job, but the instructions that we've given people or the policies that we've given people might be actually having some negative collateral consequences. Again, I don't know that. That's my my guess, but I don't have data to support any of what I'm saying.
Okay, I'm very much aware that we are well beyond time, but Gabe has had his hand up, and I think then we're just wrapping it up. Alicia, I saw your question online, I saw your hand, but I think Gabe is getting the last one, and then we will, and then we will open it for lunch. And please all stay for lunch. There's lots of food, but I will have Gabe.
Thank you.
This question.
I want to say it's very exciting to see this. I remember you talking about this in my first year at SIU.
I recognize you, yeah.
Yeah, and so it's very exciting to see this kind of culminate. And I remember the longevity of it was something that fascinated me even 7 or 8 years ago. So for me, I guess my question is, you've seen 5 different premiers over the course of this, like quite a few changes in the politics of it. And quite a bit of change in policy, both towards youth and towards incarceration in general for children. I'm curious as to how that kind of, if it did impact your access to the participants, as well as if you kind of saw any shift in your data according to different policies over 2 decades of research.
I drilled those hard questions out of you 7 years ago. I mean, politics has a lot to do with access. And I didn't start this study. This study started because my MA PhD supervisor, Ray Corrado, did a lot of work and became very familiar with people who made key decisions in British Columbia. I genuinely don't think that I could have done this study. Like I don't think that if I were to walk into that office and ask for the exact same things, I don't think I would have gotten them. Maybe it's the personnel there have changed. Maybe it has to do with, me rather than Ray. I think that it shouldn't work this way, but I think it does. It matters who you are, and it matters who is in office, and especially what they want done. And it's not just we will let everybody in. It is who is being let in and why are they being let in. So like our access has been taken away, and I really don't think that it's a political decision. I really think that the reason why our access has been removed is because of data breaches. Not that we had any, but just that we have really sensitive information on people. And I think that poses a risk. And like our university has merged research ethics and research security. And I think that tells you a lot about where we're going, where concerns are about not just ethics of I don't get any questions about research ethics. I get questions about data security. And I think that will be one of the policy changes we're seeing is the actual concern about data security affecting this. And in terms of policy changes, the Young Offenders Act compared to the Youth Criminal Justice Act, absolutely we saw changes in terms of, for example, the severity of offending, especially with girls. They were like, for girls under the YOA, it was just theft, breach, mischief under, breach. Like it wasn't for everyone, but that was, and I quoted those files. It was just in for 3 days, out for 6, in for 2, back for 10, So we found that kids under the YOA, their risk factors were different. Their offending severity was different. Their likelihood of reoffending at high rates in adulthood were also different. So that has definitely been a change, and it's important to tease apart what has been like a justice system change versus, it's not like we were able to have the justice system change, but then told every other sector that they're not allowed to change. The other sectors changed, and we couldn't account for all of that as well.
Thank you so, you want to answer it? It's up
Very
to
quickly,
you.
for Alicia, no, the majority were not reconvictions for admin offenses, but there were, I think it was maybe closer to 20%. I think it is in the paper. I took the slide out because I didn't want numbers on it. Now I'm regretting it. But thank you for the question, and I'll try and get back to you if I can about that specific answer.
Okay, thank you so much. Yeah, fantastic talk, and obviously there was
Thanks, Justin.
lots of interest. I will turn the YouTube